Phone check. 1, 2. The microphone check. 1, 2, 1, 2. The microphone check. I got my headphones tuned between two different AM stations, and my briefcase is full of declassified information. Declassified. Declassified.
Good evening and welcome to News from Neptune for the 20th week of 2015. For almost 25 years, this program has been a spontaneous and unrehearsed discussion of the news of the week and its coverage by the media. First on a so-called community radio station, and when censored and locked out of there, welcomed, I'm happy to say, by the good folks at Urbana Public Television. I'm Carl Estabrook. My discussants tonight are Aram and David Green. The program is produced and directed by Jason Liggett. Our program's name, News from Neptune, was chosen to honor Noam Chomsky, who's been talking sense about American politics for twice the quarter century we've been on the air. Chomsky has said that in the American media, either you repeat the same conventional doctrines everybody is saying, or else you say something true, and it will sound like it's from Neptune. This and previous editions of this program are archived on YouTube and posted to the Facebook page for News from Neptune, where you'll also find comments from viewers, articles we've referred to, and further comments from us. I can be reached at carl@newsfromneptune.com, and I'm happy to receive your comments. And I'm happy to say that the News from Neptune blog at newsfromneptune.com, which has been absent for a long time, is back up and running and has some of the material and some different material from the Facebook page. Today is May 15th. In 1948, May 15th is recalled as Nakba Day, the day of the catastrophe, generally commemorated on the day after the Gregorian calendar date for Israeli independence. For the Palestinians, it's an annual day of commemoration of the ethnic cleansing that preceded and followed the Israeli Declaration of Independence in 1948. An estimated 700,000 Palestinians fled or were expelled, and hundreds of Palestinian towns and villages were depopulated and destroyed. These refugees and their descendants number several million people today, divided between Jordan, with 2 million, Lebanon with 500,000, Syria with another 500,000, and the West Bank with almost 800,000. The Gaza Strip has more than 1 million Palestinians living in it, in the ruins produced by Israel last year. There's at least another 250,000 Palestinians internally displaced within the borders of the State of Israel. Today is also the anniversary in 1970 of the killings of Philip Lafayette Gibbs and James Earl Green at Jackson State University by police during student protests. The Kent State University killings early in May are commemorated, and the Jackson State killings from the same month are sometimes forgotten. They're part of the same state repression of student protest about the war in Southeast Asia at the time. Today is also the anniversary in 1988 of the beginning of the withdrawal of the Soviet troops from Afghanistan after more than 8 years of war. We'll have something to say about that and about how the Russians came to be involved in Afghanistan for those 8 years. Today, or rather tomorrow, is commencement day at the little university down the street, and we'll have a word or two to say about commencement as well. So you're watching News from Neptune, a catastrophe edition, and we'll begin with David Green.
Yes, I'm going to just follow up before I segue into what I sort of brought prepared. I wanted to follow up by a few comments regarding Israel and this day. One of the persistent myths of the history of Nakba Day, which is also Israeli Independence Day on the Gregorian, do you call it Gregorian calendar? Mm-hmm. It's the Israel Independence Day was celebrated or observed a month ago according to, I guess, the lunar calendar, but today is also Israeli Independence Day. And what's, as well as Nakba Day, and what's often not understood is that the Nakba was in full process by the time this day came around. Of course, we observed the anniversary of the famous massacre at Deir Yassin on April 9th, which was a full 5 weeks before May 15th, when Israel declared its independence and was recognized as a state. But really the violence began when the UN partition agreement went down in November of 1947. So there was a full 6-month period in which there was, I guess, what could be fairly called a civil war, a relatively unequal civil war, during which perhaps of the 700,000 or 800,000 Palestinians who were displaced, who were ultimately displaced, 200,000 or 300,000 were displaced during that period in late 1947 and early 1948, in which you had breakouts of violence, most notoriously in Jaffa and Haifa. So that's just one of the things that we need to remind ourselves as we reconstruct a more accurate version of Israeli history. One of those people who has done that is the Israeli, sort of expatriate Israeli historian Ilan Pappé, who is now in England and who has recently had an article on some of the left-wing websites, including, I think, including ZNet, in regards to some of his more recent work, was actually in which he's collaborating with Noam Chomsky. And so it's interesting to read what Ilan Pappé has said, and he's also written a book about the entire history of how what he calls neo-Zionism, subsequent to post-Zionism, in which Israel has kind of rescued the Zionist narrative. The neo-Zionists are most identified with the popular book by an Israeli journalist named Ari Shavit called My Promised Land. And these are basically apologetics for continuing to justify Israel's persecution of the Palestinian people. I would also refer to the wonderful coverage, let me also refer to an article that was in the News Gazette, a rare, relatively objective article about Israel that they carried from the AP this morning, regarding the displacement of Bedouins by Israel in the Negev Desert, which is part of Israel proper, because they have a whole plan there to bring in Jewish settlements. And while the article doesn't do a very good job at giving context in terms of the persecution of the Bedouin in the Negev, this has been going on for many years, and this is really a part of that. But at least it does offer some facts in terms of what is going on. It's inadequate, but it's something, and it's not, at least it's not horrible in terms of journalism. And I guess the last thing I would mention in reference to what you might miss in the mainstream coverage, the Real News Network, trnn.com, has good coverage from correspondents in Israel, and Shir Hever, who lives in Germany but comments very astutely on, especially on the sort of political economy of Israel. They also had an interview within the last few days from Leah Tarachansky, who's an emerging correspondent there, who is actually immigrated from Russia and found herself growing up in a Jewish settlement on the West Bank, but has done remarkable work in discovering and understanding what's going on in Israel. She had a piece on the Real News about the Ethiopian situation and the relative rebellion of Ethiopian Jews who are immigrants, who are Israeli citizens, but who are discriminated against within Israel, and also the relationship between the Ethiopian Africans and the refugees, the non-Jewish refugees from Africa that have arrived in Israel in recent years, and what the complicated relationships are there. Israel is obviously a very complicated place, and she refers to it not as a democracy, but as an ethnocracy, and I think she explains that pretty well in this interview. So that's my follow-up to that. I don't know if either of you wanted to raise a point, or I could go on to a completely different topic.
Okay, well, I might mentioned that recalling the past and current crimes of the State of Israel is particularly important, I think, for Americans who have such a bad idea of why the U.S. continues to support those crimes. For most Americans who recognize the settler colonial state that is Israel and the crimes it committed 67 years ago and more, and since, the question is, why does the U.S. continue to support Israel as it does all along? In a discussion, a political discussion at the market on Saturday, had a bemused gentleman who saw himself as well informed on these issues, saying that he thought the most interesting thing was that Israel used to direct American policy, and now Saudi Arabia direct American policy. And wasn't that remarkable that there's been such a switch? And I said, yeah, it is remarkable because, in fact, it didn't happen. Both Israel and Saudi Arabia are clients of the U.S., and the support for the policies of Israel and Saudi Arabia grow from the first place out of the constant U.S. policy going back to the Second World War of controlling Middle East energy resources. And Israel is a stationary aircraft carrier in the Middle East.
And a character.
A character too, I suppose. A character in the drama, but an aircraft carrier for the military domination of the region. Yeah. And Saudi Arabia, of course, is the leading oil producer in the region. So there's no mystery about American politics except for the constant American lies about it. The lies of every administration up to and including the current one. Now, we've had two interesting examples of lies about American policy. One of my first political teachers, the late I.F. Stone, used to take as the fundamental line, all governments lie. But most Americans don't really believe that, I think. We assume that the U.S. is out searching for democracy and peace, and all these foreigners keep getting in the way. But in fact, the consistency of American policy in the Middle East can be read off going back to 1948, going back to the days of the Nakba, and the American-Israeli relations depend upon that consistent policy, that policy of trying to control the energy resources of the region. We've had two recent examples of government lies about what they're doing and the necessity of trying to understand what's really happening. The account of the assassination of Osama bin Laden, described in an important article by Seymour Hersh that couldn't be published in the United States and was published in the London Review of Books last month. And an argument amongst the Republican presidential candidates, all of them avid for Wall Street support, of course, about what to do about the Republican responsibility for the invasion of Iraq. And there seems to be an agreement to say, well, we were just misinformed. The government was just misinformed. The Bush administration thought they had weapons of mass destruction, but doggone they didn't. And that's a shame. Sorry, we blew that one, and we won't make mistakes like that anymore. We'll get better intelligence next time. Now, this is all nonsense, but it's nonsense based upon this notion that the U.S. policy is not what, in fact, it is, an attempt to control the region and its resources, and the perfect willingness to use lies of every sort across the board by all administrations in order to deal with the only enemy the U.S. really fears, the U.S. government really fears, and that, of course, is the U.S. public, and to make sure that the U.S. public is misled about what's going on all these matters.
I have one comment on what you just said, and I agree. I think this is important to clarify. I think the image that a lot of people out there have is that the U.S. is basically the good cop and good at heart and well-meaning. They're just weak. And the Democrats are good people and well-meaning. They're just weak. And Obama, he's just weak, and that's why he's giving in too much to the Iranians, et cetera, et cetera.
Astonishing.
This is an image that has been projected, and that's why I think it's so important to keep coming back and explaining who's really in charge. And it's not, the good cop and the bad cop. That's a game. That's a game they play. They're both cops. Make no mistake. So.
And it works.
For when you were talking about that, when you were making your first comments, Carl, for some reason the image of Edgar Bergen and Charlie McCarthy came to my mind. I don't know why, it just came out of nowhere.
Right, right.
I guess that shows my age for
I
one
was going to
thing,
say,
but,
for our younger listeners,
Right,
you
they
know,
that
don't
was
know who you're talking
that was
about.
like a real person and a puppet, I guess you would call that.
Yeah.
So, yeah. Anyway, so
Jason, do you know who Edgar Bergen and Charlie McCarthy are? There we are. You know, that's
all
the
right.
voice of the
After
current. That's the
after
voice
the
of the
show,
current.
after the show, we'll update you on Edgar Bergen, who's actually the father of Candace Bergen. You've probably heard of her.
Who's already?
You know what?
Not
I
even-
doubt it.
I got to say,
The
I
younger
think Fred's right.
generation
Yeah.
won't
All
know.
right.
Now, if you mention Murphy Brown, some young women might.
All
They
right.
might.
Yeah, right.
But
So I'm too old for Murphy Brown, but anyway.
okay.
Actually, you're not.
But anyway, let me sort of switch gears here and sort of actually continue to a certain extent conversation we started last week about race and cities and urban areas and moving African Americans around to improve their lot and so on and so forth. And this is an excerpt from someone who I respect and who I enjoyed hearing. Richard Rothstein is a researcher, economist, social researcher at the Economic Policy Institute. I know him more from his work in educational research, debunking a lot of the mythology about test scores and American inferiority to the rest of the world and that sort of thing. But he's also been doing some good work on urban policy, and he was interviewed on the program Counterspin last week, which is sponsored by the group Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting. And it's an interview, just a 9 or 10 minute interview, well worth listening to, putting Baltimore in the context of the history of urban policy. I looked up another article of his, I think it was on the EPI website, and I think he was also interviewed on NPR recently. And it kind of brought us back to a point in American history where important decisions were being made. I think it's important to understand there's been a long continuity of actual policy to create the kind of economic and class and racial divisions that we see bubbling up in places like Ferguson and Baltimore and everywhere else. And it spans everything from Jim Crow to the drug war, and it also around in the 60s and 70s had a lot to do with debates around urban policy and how to deal with the ghetto. And what he writes, an interesting excerpt, a little bit out of context, from this one article, he writes, in 1970, declaring that the federal government had established a quote-unquote white noose around ghettos in Baltimore and other cities, HUD, that's Housing and Urban Development, Secretary George Romney, there's a lot of blasts from the past here in a fascinating way.
The father of the recent presidential candidate.
Right. HUD Secretary George Romney proposed denying federal funds for sewers, water projects, parkland, or redevelopment to all-white suburbs that resisted integration by maintaining exclusionary zoning ordinances that prohibited multi-unit construction, or by refusing to accept subsidized moderate income or public low income housing. In the case of Baltimore County, he withheld a sewer grant that had previously been committed because of the county's policies of residential segregation. And in his interview on Counterspin, Rothstein goes into this explicit legal, not just de facto but de jure approach to segregation in Baltimore that had its roots in previous decades. He goes on, it was in terms of Romney's move to his basically liberal move in the context of what we often refer to as the most liberal administration in the history of this country, that of Richard Nixon. It was a very controversial move, but Romney got support from Vice President Spiro Agnew, who had been, as governor of Maryland, before he became vice president, had been frustrated by the unreasonable suburban resistance to integration and mixed income developments when he had been the Baltimore County executive and governor of Maryland. In a 1970 speech to the National Alliance of Businessmen, Agnew attacked attempts to solve the country's racial problems by pouring money into the inner city, as had been done in the Johnson administration. Agnew said that he flatly rejected the assumption that, quote, because the primary problems of race and poverty are found in the ghettos of urban America, the solutions to these problems must also be found there. Resources, and this is continuing the quote of Agnew, resources needed to solve the urban poverty problem, land, money, jobs, exist in substantial supply in suburban areas, but are not being sufficiently utilized in solving inner city problems, end quote. So this all in the context of the, and it's fascinating because I don't agree, in a sense, I don't agree with the approach that the problem of the inner city should not have been solved in the inner city. I think that, and we were talking about last week, is that resources can be invested properly in the inner city in many ways to deal with poverty without necessarily dealing with segregation or integration per se. But this was a debate that was very lively in the late 60s and early 70s. It was a part of the, I recall it as being part of the debate between Robert Kennedy and Gene McCarthy as they were vying for votes in the California Democratic Party primary before Kennedy was killed. But as we look back at this era, at least, and what Rothstein is pointing out is that there was a very different debate than what we have now after 40 years of the drug war, after 40 years of I mean, the myth of the culture of poverty, or the sort of Daniel Moynihan myth of the black family was alive and well back then. But even and Moynihan ended up serving in Republican administrations under Nixon, and later being a Democratic senator. But nevertheless, even Republicans were talking about urban policy in terms of changing some of those patterns and challenging some of the mythology of that time. And again, going back to George Romney, what happened to the Romney family? Romney was basically, because he had relatively enlightened policies for urban renewal and so forth. I shouldn't say urban renewal, because that deserves a very bad name in terms of the way it was enacted in the 1960s. But still, Romney had relatively enlightened policies, which have obviously not been adopted by at least one of his children.
Comments, Karen?
No.
Do you have a comment on David's observations
no.
about? Yeah. One that occurs to me is that there's your description of Spiro Agnew and the liberal administration of Richard Nixon, and this is an important point to remember. The administration was liberal in that the policies that it followed, some that it accomplished and some that it didn't, were the most liberal of any administration up to and including the Obama administration since the Second World War. Now, that doesn't mean that either Richard Nixon or even Spiro Agnew himself were paragons of liberalism. It does mean that the circumstances of the times and the pressure from the country as a whole were such that even an administration presided over by those two reprobates had to do things that were indeed beneficial and were not able to get away with the narrow austerity program followed by the Obama administration. And that's worthwhile. It's worthwhile to remember in that some things are possible if you indeed have a political movement and an enlightened, to some extent at least, populace that demands these things. That's what happened then. Even the interesting example you mentioned, one of the most interesting people involved in that, Daniel Patrick Moynihan, whose name will forever be connected to the policies that you described, was the leader of the attempt to establish nothing less than a guaranteed annual income in the Nixon administration, and wrote an account of how that went down, how that happened, drawing on the social science from work of people that we think of as conservatives or reactionaries even, like Milton Friedman, and the way in which it was destroyed. The attempt to establish the negative income tax was destroyed by the Democrats largely. When it was an initiative of the Nixon administration responding to those popular demands of the time. Moynihan wrote an account of it, and it's very much worth reading, not only for the story itself, but for the contrast with the present, and the way in which neoliberal parties, both Republican and Democrat, have engineered us away from the sort of demands that produced the social progress of that most liberal post-World War II administration, the Nixon administration. And it's a blueprint of what can be done now, what can be done again in these, in some sense, much darker times. It's what's necessary, but it doesn't look like happening. There's an interesting parallel between Spiro Agnew, Nixon's vice president, and a former Maryland governor, and in the current career of Martin O'Malley, who's mentioned as one of the liberal challengers to Hillary Clinton for the presidential nomination of the Democrats in 2016. O'Malley is an interesting fellow. He was mayor of Baltimore and governor of Maryland, and established a reputation as a liberal in contemporary standards, liberals today, and is represented as a liberal challenger to Hillary. In fact, as mayor of Baltimore, he established one of the tough on crime administrations that were so popular in the last generation in American cities, as the neoliberal pall was cast over the social problems that David was describing. So O'Malley is in a peculiar situation, it seems to me, in the troubles that have occurred in Baltimore, in that he's responsible in part for them, and yet he is being able to present himself as a liberal Democrat. So there's more to be said about this, but it would be extremely worthwhile if the discussion actually took into account a real account of what happened. It doesn't look like happening. You're watching News from Neptune. We are talking about the news of the week and its coverage by the media, and we'll go to Karen Aram. What's on your mind, Karen?
Well, migrants and people drowning at sea. Karen Medina Levy did mention, maybe it was a couple months ago, some weeks ago, unaware, the SS Louis, was it SS St. Louis? That was the ship in 1939 that fled Nazi Germany. The passengers were Jewish, they were fleeing, and they were not taken in by anyone. The ship's captain did everything he could to try to find a home for them, so to speak. There were like 930, 950, I'm not sure. But the U.S. turned them away. Cuba, who was our friend and ally at the time, turned them away, and Canada turned them away. I think they eventually were docked at Belgium, and I think eventually many of them were dispersed throughout Europe. It's known, though, that at least, I think, a quarter of them, I may not have my figures completely correct, but I think at least a quarter of them died in concentration camps. Okay, this is something that is little known amongst most people today. There was a film, Voyage of the Damned, that came out based upon the book, and I don't remember when that was. Maybe it was in the 50s or 60s, I'm not sure. But for some of us who, once we found this out, we were sort of horrified that our government would turn them away like that, given what they were facing, and given that this was 1939, it was not 1931. So we knew exactly what was likely to happen. And we like to think that we became a more humane society since then. Well, now we have fleeing Burma, which is suddenly getting a lot of press, something I've talked about when people talk about Burma, or as people know it today, Myanmar. Excuse me. the killing of the Rohingya. The Rohingya are the people who are of Muslim descent. They're in the north, Arakan state primarily. They have been there, the original Rohingyas have been there for centuries. Many of them have come over from Bangladesh, but there's a lot of strife, so it appears, between the Muslims and the Buddhists, yet I really doubt that. And the reason I doubt it is because I know the political activists of the past who have been opposing the Burmese dictatorship. They're all Buddhist, and they are horrified by what is the killing that has taken place since Burma has opened up, since Aung San Suu Kyi has been freed, the rightfully elected leader who was under house arrest for I don't know how many, 20 some years. And since the U.S. has become more involved, we did have sanctions against doing any business with Burma. We still have some sanctions, but we've been getting around a lot of them. And right now we are, this image that is being presented by the West that Burma is now, changed. It's a nice place. No, the leadership is still the same, basically, even if they're operating with proxies. Well, what they're doing is they're not just oppressing the Rohingyas, they're killing them. And so the Rohingyas are fleeing by the boatloads, and nobody is taking them in. Now, Nicholas Christopherson wrote about this in yesterday's New York Times. He wrote an especially good article. Malaysia and Thailand and Indonesia, the nations there, who are all members of ASEAN, they're refusing to accept them. Now, we know Malaysia and Indonesia, the focus is on them because they're Muslim nations. So there's an assumption that somehow this is something to do with religion, which I really do not believe for a moment it does. I think you do have some famous monk who's been fomenting a lot of the discord, but he's a puppet of the military regime. Also, today I posted something on Facebook that came from someone in Thailand, was also complaining about Malaysia needing to take them in. But she didn't talk about, evidently Thailand is now going to take them in, or they've agreed to, due to pressure. But at least Christopherson talks about the fact that Thailand has been doing some pretty lousy things as well. People are pushing the boats back out into the water. So they're not doing just what the Europeans, we have the same issue with our people fleeing, with so many people, fleeing North Africa, fleeing Yemen right now as Saudi, our proxy, is bombing Yemen. We have, I don't know the exact number, but we have thousands of people there not being taken in. And yes, you've got someone claiming, well, let's destroy the boats so they can't get on the boats and flee. But at the end of the day, they're not pushing them back out to sea to die, okay? And this is what's happening in Southeast Asia. They're actually pushing them out to sea to die. And we're looking at not just 1,000, we're looking at 8,000, 9,000, 10,000. So we're talking about thousands of people out there, women and children and men, and none of these are combatants, but they are dying of starvation, they are dying from exposure, they are dying from dehydration and drowning. I can't imagine anything more inhumane that we, and I'm sorry, it is on us, this is on our doorstep, that we are allowing to happen.
Yeah, why is it an American problem? What's the U.S. policy here?
Because the influence in Burma is very strong on the part of the U.S. China is backing away. Now, China has been using Burma as their playground for some years now, while the U.S. had sanctions. But China's backing away because they're finding, I think it's due to the U.S. Pressure on Burma, primarily to cancel the railroad project they had with China due to the problems. I think, Carl, you mentioned today something in the Kochang area where you have ethnic ethnic strife throughout Burma because there's so many ethnic groups, okay, that have been fighting this military junta for. This has been going on for not just decades, but I mean for many, many decades. And evidently some Chinese citizens on the China border have been killed by mortar attacks. So there's a lot of strife going on, but I think China, according to what I've read recently, is sort of backing away from business in Burma because of the instability, the political instability. And
You know,
go ahead. No, you go ahead.
I was just going to say, is it fair to draw a parallel between Burma? I think most Americans still, if they know where the country is at all, they know it under the name Burma and not Myanmar. But is it worthwhile to draw any sort of parallel at all between Burma and Ukraine? In the
Yes.
sense that in both of these countries on the border of a major Eurasian power, the U.S. is meddling primarily because it wants to cripple that major Eurasian power,
Oh,
Russia in the
yes.
first case and China in the
Yes.
second case, and that the
Yes.
U.S. involvement in Burma is primarily a matter of calling a halt to the economic integration of Eurasia that's being presided over by China, particularly their new Silk Road and whatnot.
Right. No, that's absolutely it. I'm sorry, I left that part out. I mean,
No, you said it before on
I said
this
it
and other
before.
programs.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes, I tend not to forget some of the things I've said in the past, but yes, I mean, Burma is known for its wealth of natural resources. It's been cut off from the West for so long. And of course, it's gems and uranium and et cetera, but it's strategic. It's a strategic location. It's right smack dab between China and India. So yes, that's why. What I'm surprised at, I know that the U.S. has been involved ever since 1988 when maybe it was the early 90s. In 88 is when a lot of the students fled and became exiled in Thailand. And that's how I became familiar with the activists and working with them. And I do remember, I think it was around 1993, I'm guessing it was around 1993 when they told me that, because I had been taking them to the Foreign Correspondents Club, introducing them to people who worked with the U.S. Embassy. And they told me that they were finally approached in their headquarters in the north, Manor Plow, which was up in the Chiang Mai area at that time. It was destroyed a few years, well, actually it was destroyed around 1999, I think. And because they were also working with the Karen ethnic group. But they were finally approached by U.S. diplomats, and the only question they were asked at the time was, do they support capitalism? And of course they said yes. I mean, why wouldn't they? I mean, and I know that they've been supported over the years, and I think I've been in touch with only one recent, but top level, who did tell me that when I asked why is the dictatorship now suddenly killing the Muslims in Burma, okay, the Rohingya? And his only response was, and I hope he doesn't get in trouble for my even repeating this, I notice I can't get anything in English from him anymore. Everything is on his Facebook in Burmese. He did say, because they think the U.S. is coming. And so I can't help but think this instability, even though we know China wanted the railroad to go right through Arakan State. And so that area was very important to them because that would give them a port right there on the Indian Ocean. Nonetheless, China has pulled back, that contract was broken, and that's when the killing is breaking out. So I just can't help thinking that the U.S. is somehow behind it. And we certainly have the power and the influence. And when Senator Kerry was in Burma last time, and I talked about this on Aware, some people criticized him because he never mentioned the Rohingya situation. And and a lot of people, we've criticized Aung San Suu Kyi because she refused to discuss it when she was traveling, the killing of the Muslims, because she felt, well, that wasn't for her to take up. She was not a member of parliament, whatever. She wasn't in a position to do that, which is why we come back to something we have talked about before, leaders feeling somehow like Mandela, people who have sacrificed years and years of their life to bring about democracy or to bring about political justice to their people, and when they suddenly actually have it and they're freed, then they start to back down because of the economics. They don't want to rock the boat because they think they can actually work with these people. But does anybody think they could work with Hitler? Does anybody think, Mandela thought that, okay, we can have foreign investors come in and somehow that will improve the economy in South Africa. does Aung San Suu Kyi really think, I mean, they amended the Constitution to ensure that she could never run.
The best example I can think of the phenomenon you describe is the former president of Czechoslovakia, leader of the Velvet Revolution.
Right.
I'm blocking on his name, right?
Václav Havel.
Yes.
Václav Havel,
Yes.
whose behavior was precisely what you just summarized.
Yeah.
It is a phenomenon that should be recognized, it seems to me. It's important. Thank you for that, Karen. Comment, David?
I'm not familiar. I have heard disparaging comments about Aung San Suu Kyi for quite a while.
You can say her name, though. I
yeah.
can't get it out. I can't get it
I'm
out
not
straight.
sure that I said it right.
You did. You
Okay,
did. Aung San
well,
Suu
that
Kyi.
was,
Yeah.
it was
It's
sort
not,
of an accident that I did, I think. But yeah, the comment would be to reiterate sort of what you. I mean, everything needs to be understood in this investor neoliberal context in which every country is in the position of marketing its resources, marketing its labor, finding a place in terms of the global investment climate, whether it's in relation to other countries or the IMF or however that works. But I'm not familiar enough to know what the details are in relation to Burma and how that plays out in relationship to the geopolitics of the Chinese border areas it's more clear in terms of the Russian border areas, but unfortunately Southeast Asia gets a little bit below the radar in my world.
of course.
Except for you, Karen. Except for you, being in my world.
But it is something to watch very carefully because it really should be on our radar because of China. If nothing else, sorry, friends in Thailand who are unhappy with the military junta there, at the end of the day, it's all about China and always has been. Let me just say this about Aung San Suu Kyi. The disparaging remarks about her probably are very unfair, rather a disappointment, but because honestly, I don't know what the solution is. We wish that she would have spoken out against the killings of the Rohingya. But I don't think it would have made any difference. I can also understand why leaders, and that's what I keep thinking, that the Greek Syriza, that they're trying to work with the IMF, they're trying to work with the EU. They still think that maybe, just maybe, they can get something out of it. But at the end of the day, I've always said, you lay down with dogs, you get fleas. That's you're probably not going to get anywhere. And in fact, now Aung San Suu Kyi has come out and said that it's likely she will boycott the elections. But again, I don't know what that will solve either. So.
Thank you indeed. I want to comment on another of the anniversaries, such as it is today, that in 1988 the Russians began their withdrawal from Afghanistan after an 8-year invasion. This week, NATO announced quietly that it's extending its stay in Afghanistan, in spite of the things the Obama administration has said for years about American withdrawal. That's not, in fact, taking place. And America, of course, has the American invasion of Afghanistan was begun more than 13 years ago and shows no sign of ending, in spite of the consistent lies of the Obama administration that it's ending and we're withdrawing. There's a lesson here, it seems to me, a lesson about the nature of American politics and the way in which what's actually said by the American government is very far from the truth about the policy that it's actually following. But it's worthwhile to be reminded that this policy has been followed consistently by all American administrations, Republican and Democrat. The policy of invasion, the policy of killing people in the Middle East in order to ensure control is by no means new. And the anniversary of the Russian withdrawal, or the beginning of the Russian withdrawal, reminds me of the important interview that Jimmy Carter's national security advisor, President Carter's national security advisor, Zbigniew Brzezinski, gave to a French publication, and the French, in their delicacy, made sure that the copy of the interview that was published in the United States excluded these damning comments by the Carter National Security Advisor about how the U.S. was responsible for the Russian invasion of Afghanistan. The interview is worth recalling, and I'm actually going to read a bit of it for you, since it reads quite sharply differently from the way it did even when it appeared in the 90s. This was Zbigniew Brzezinski being interviewed about his policy, that is the policy of the U.S. government, in regard to Afghanistan and Russia in the 1970s. Question. The former director of the CIA, Robert Gates, stated in his memoirs that American intelligence services began to aid the Mujahideen. The Mujahideen were the jihadists, the religious opponents of the government of Afghanistan, the Islamicist fighters that were in effect created by the CIA. The American intelligence service began to aid the Mujahideen in Afghanistan 6 months before the Soviet intervention in 1980. In this period, you were National Security Advisor to President Carter. You therefore played a role in this affair. Is that correct? Brzezinski, yes. According to the official version of history, i.e. the lies, CIA to the Mujahideen began during 1980, that is to say, after the Soviet Army invaded Afghanistan. But the reality, secretly guarded until now, is completely otherwise. Indeed, it was July 3, 1979, that President Carter signed the first directive for secret aid to the opponents of the pro-Soviet regime in Kabul. And that very day, I wrote a note to the President, which I explained to him that, in my opinion, this aid was going to induce a Soviet military intervention. Question. Despite this risk, you were an advocate of the covert action, but perhaps you yourself desired the Soviet entry into war and looked to provoke it? Brzezinski, it isn't quite that. We didn't push the Russians to intervene, but we knowingly increased the probability that they would. Question. When the Soviets justified their intervention by asserting that they intended to fight against a secret involvement of the United States in Afghanistan, people didn't believe them. However, there was a basis of truth. You don't regret anything today? Brzezinski, regret what? The secret operation was an excellent idea. It had the effect of drawing the Russians into the Afghan trap. And you want me to regret it? The day that the Soviets officially crossed the border, I wrote to President Carter, we now have the opportunity of giving to the USSR its own Vietnam War. Indeed, for almost 10 years, Moscow had to carry on a war unsupportable by the government, a conflict that brought about the demoralization and finally the breakup of the Soviet Empire. This is Brzezinski interpreting the lies of the time. Question. And neither do you regret having supported the Islamic fundamentalism, having given arms and advice to future terrorists? Brzezinski, what is more important to the history of the world, the Taliban or the collapse of the Soviet Empire? Some stirred up Muslims or the liberation of Central Europe and the end of the Cold War? Question. Some stirred up Muslims, but it's been said and repeated Islamic fundamentalism represents a world menace today. Brzezinski, nonsense. It's said that the West had a global policy in regard to Islam. That is stupid. There isn't a global Islam. Look at Islam in a rational manner and with demagoguery or emotion. It is the leading religion of the world with 1.5 billion followers. And what is there in common among Saudi Arabian fundamentalism, moderate Morocco, Pakistan militarism, Egyptian pro-Western, or Central Asian secularism? Nothing more than what unites the Christian countries. Well, of course, American policy has been to make sure that militant Islam, Islamicist, the Islamicist fighters, jihadism, is a consistent player in world politics from that time. And the important point to see here is that this was consistent with American policy in spite of what Brzezinski admits were lies about what the U.S. was doing at the time. When we talk about American foreign policy, particularly in the context of political campaigns and so forth, we should realize that we're dealing in a fantasy world constructed by the American government about what they're doing and why they're doing it. You know, let a few years go by and they even admit it, as Brzezinski does here. Yeah. Comments?
Well, to take a little bit of a contrarian point of view, I mean, the thing that I've been thinking lately is, even though I understand all of what's being said about strategy and geopolitics and oil and so forth and militarism, you want stability. If they want stability, if that's really what they want, I mean, it's a slippery word.
Yes.
But if they want stability, it's hard to understand why they do the kind of things that they do in order to achieve instability. I mean, in the 1980s, Iraq was an ally of ours, and they were our relationship with them, especially after the fall of the Shah in Iran, was more or less the centerpiece of our foreign policy. And our relationship with Syria was relatively stable in that sense, and Syria itself was a stabilizing force, especially in relation to its occupation of Lebanon from the 1970s to the 2000s. And all that began to be turned over. It's hard to place when it began to be turned over, but certainly when you know, during the 1980s is the experience you just talked about, and then of course in 1990 was Iraq's invasion of Kuwait, and then the first Persian Gulf War. We just couldn't resist even though we had the option of allowing Saddam Hussein to get off the hook. We couldn't resist destabilizing the whole situation and then invading in 2003. So as much as the attractions of the language of stability, we certainly couldn't, our leaders, whatever their goals and motives and everything, couldn't have wanted the rise of ISIS. They couldn't have wanted the millions of you know, all of the contradictory forces you see now in Yemen and so forth. They couldn't feel like they're in control of all that, and that this is a better outcome in terms of their control of oil or whatever else it is they want in that region. I see, to a certain extent, I see on the one hand you have the strategy, on the other hand you have these very flawed people, I mean, doing crazy things. I mean, they are doing crazy things.
But
I'll give you a chance on this, but I want to go after this one just for a minute, Karen. As the poet says, the best laid plans of mice and men gang after glay. You often go wrong, and I think that's what we're talking about here. Plans that in many cases have gone quite wrong. I mean, it's Brzezinski's construction of jihadist fighters in the 1970s as an anti-Russian move that leads to 9/11. I mean, these are the people who do 9/11 after all, and to understand how that happens, it is worthwhile to trace the connections, but to see the consistency of American policy, particularly the concern about the control of Eurasia, which Brzezinski has been absolutely clear about in his writings on what he did as National Security Advisor and his general notions on American foreign policy, which simply repeats the common notion of the American government. One of the main things we have to remember here is the peculiar American definition of stability. What is stability? What is a stable nation? A stable nation is a nation that does what Washington, D.C. tells it to do. An unstable nation is a nation that's resisting doing what Washington, D.C. Tells it to do. And if we have that definition clear, then we can understand how the U.S. government is working for stability and is shocked by the appearance of instability within its domains. That's what we're talking about here, and I think this is an important example of this. The very first edition of News from Neptune occurred in the summer of 1990 and discussed the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait. And at the time, we didn't know any of the details that have since emerged about the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait, and we still don't know too much about what actually happened. What happened, as you pointed out, David, was that up until that summer, the Saddam Hussein regime in Iraq was a stone ally of the U.S.
And
I mean,
George Bush loved him. George Bush the first.
the wonderful picture
as Chomsky always says, George Bush just loved him.
wonderful picture of the defense secretary, Bush Jr.'s defense secretary, shaking hands with Saddam Hussein and telling him what a great guy he was, and so on. Yeah, what happened? We're still not clear what did happen. Did Saddam's regime simply go off the reservation and start doing something that wasn't, or did it think that it had? Well, no, let me start over again. Let's try to say that differently. The invasion of Kuwait by Saddam Hussein was undertaken with the understanding that the U.S. approved. The last thing Saddam Hussein did before sending troops into Kuwait was to check with the American ambassador, April Glaspie, let her know that that's what we were going to do, that's what they were going to do, and seek approval. Now, the approval was either a mistake on Washington's part or a trap. There are those who suggested that the U.S. wanted Saddam Hussein to do such a thing in the interest of stability, because Saddam Hussein was threatening to become unstable, and therefore stability had to be restored by deposing him. And that this would lead to that. That seems to me fantastic, certainly possible. Much more likely, I think, is that Saddam checked with the Americans as he was supposed to and didn't understand the answer, or the Americans didn't understand him. There's a third possibility, and really the most likely, and that is that the Americans said, fine, go ahead, take care of the Kuwaitis. They were sort of a pain in the neck anyhow, and then it went wrong. It produced too much upset. Too many people were concerned about the invasion of Kuwait. And therefore, the U.S. said, we'll have to scotch this. There are several possibilities.
Okay, two things. One, I want to make a comment that I need to reiterate constantly, and that is the image sometimes, and this is in regards to Asia, the image of the U.S. going in and telling leaders in these Asian countries what to do and how to do it, et cetera, is a little misguided. That is not exactly what's happening. In fact, that's not at all what's happening. The U.S. goes in, say, to Burma, and they let them know that, you know, we want to work with you, blah, 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 we will pay, we will do this, we will do that. And the Burmese then play their card against the Chinese and play their card against the U.S., and most of the time they're looking for the better deal. And we usually end up paying through the nose. We cannot out-negotiate China, I can assure you. The same thing in Thailand. Like I said, they're not these weak, poor Asians that, trust me, they've been at this game a lot longer than we have, and they're the ones that know who's carrying the money bags and how they can make best use of it.
Karen, we're going to have to take this up. We're almost out of time, and
I'm sorry. Okay.
No, this is
be
very important.
This has to be noted that most of the time we're the ones that are being led by the nose. I was just going to make one more statement on ISIS. Some people think that ISIS wants us to send our soldiers over there so they can fight us on their own territory, which is why they're being so provocative. And that's something that I think if it's really ISIS being provocative, that certainly makes more sense than...
We will take this up on future editions. You've been watching News from Neptune for the 20th week of 2015, a catastrophe edition. It's the commencement at the little university down the street tomorrow. Quote, if you studied the sciences or engineering, especially petroleum engineering, according to a study done by Georgetown University, maybe you'll be able to earn enough money to pay your student debt, you graduates. But most of you have wasted your money with degrees in subjects that won't help you understand the real world we live in or earn an extra dime in it. Many of you have actually spent the best years of your lives and borrowed a fortune to learn things that aren't true. History, economics, government, politics, for every useful and truthful insight you may have learned, there are probably 100 more that were buried under claptrap. For largely accidental reasons, I have been privileged to attend and teach in some of the most prestigious educational institutions in the U.S. for more than half a century. What have I learned? The truth of American philosopher John Dewey's observation from a century ago that our colleague Ron Zook often quotes: education is not preparation for life, education is life itself. Stop thinking about tomorrow. Sufficient for the day is the evil thereof. I'm Carl Estabrook. My discussants tonight have been Aram and David Green. Our thanks to our director and producer, Jason Liggett. Upcoming programs here on UPTV include Labor's Worldview with Neptuner David Johnson on Sunday afternoon. See our Facebook page for news from Neptune, and the blog News from Neptune is back up after a long absence. Inshallah, we'll be back next week with a new edition of News from Neptune to remind you, in the words of Edward de Vere, what's past is prologue, what to come, and yours and my discharge. In the meantime, confusion to our enemies, and a good night to you.